The subject of today's sermon is offerings. Now, these are not the offerings that we think of whenever we're going to keep the holy days, because we are at that time collecting an offering by passing the plate. And everybody puts something in an envelope and drops it in the plate. So that's our typical concept of what we mean when we use the word offering. But there's another entirely different set of concepts, and it's multiple, whenever we mention the word offering. And that is a series of things found in the early part of the book of Leviticus. The offerings, which refer to sacrifices of animals that occur as they actively were practiced, at least in the early history of the nation of Israel, and all the way through the nation of Israel, the history of the nation of Israel, as far as that goes. There is a concept which is fostered in part by a talent evaluation company that evaluates aptitudes and talents, Johnson O'Connor. Johnson O'Connor believes, and they have very good evidence for what they believe, that there is a connection between the vocabulary that you have and the concepts which you have mastered. So they feel that you will not acquire and retain an item of vocabulary unless you have first mastered the concept which that vocabulary refers to. So mastering the concept is important to mastering the piece of vocabulary. In the case of offerings, we probably have mastered the segment which has to do with what we normally think of as offerings, and we practice those on 7 days out of the year, every year, so we were experienced with those, and we have repeated it over and over, but we're not so knowledgeable about the other kinds of offerings, and we probably haven't mastered that very well. I don't think that many people, I think that many people have not understood or mastered that concept, and yet it's an important concept that exists in the holy days, an important concept that exists throughout the book of Leviticus, not just in the holy days, but it is also an important concept that we read about in the book of Leviticus on the holy days. Leviticus chapter 23, we look at what it has to say there about the offerings, and we read over and over those things every year, but I don't have the feeling that we really understand what we're reading when we read about those offerings that we find in Leviticus 23. Now, we're not going to go through Leviticus 23 and read each one of those offerings as they're instructed to be given there in Leviticus 23. We will refer to them 2 or 3 times, but that's not what we're going to do. Point is, this also travels under the title of offerings. Offer an offering, it says in Leviticus 23, made by fire. and it's nevertheless a concept. Even though we read it, we really haven't practiced, and we never will practice it, as far as I can tell. But we read about it, and there must be some reason why God put it in there, and yet we don't necessarily read it with understanding. There is a lot of information about the offerings that are put into a lot of the Old Testament scriptures. And yet we don't pay very much attention to those in comparison. So I guess I would say there's a guiding principle that makes me think about this and makes me start to consider it and think in terms of what should we be learning and knowing about this. Now, it's probably in the early 2000s, I gave a series of sermons on the 5 different offerings found in the book of Leviticus. There are 5 different offerings that that we find in the book of Leviticus. Now, here's a guiding principle. They're put in right in the very opening of the book of Leviticus. They're put in. We'll look at that in a minute. And as they are put in there, this question occurs to me: is God just wasting our time with those things, or are there things for us to learn by looking at those offerings? And I have to conclude that there is a purpose in having these in the book of Leviticus for us, or God would not have put them there. Some interesting, so what we want to do is examine the 5 offerings. And that's the way the book of Leviticus starts, with 5 offerings. It just kicks off right away and starts talking about offerings that seemingly they wouldn't have had much information about, but there they are, right at the beginning of this book. I think that understanding the book of Leviticus and understanding some general information about Leviticus is a key, not necessarily the only key, but it is a key to understanding the offerings that are given. First of all, I'd like to, in this general information, talk to you about the fact that the book takes on the name of the tribe of Sermonette. We talked about Levi. It takes on the name, at least as far as the English language versions are concerned, of the tribe of Levi. So that's an interesting thing. It is not found to be that way in the Estonian Bible. It just calls it the 3rd book of Moses. In fact, it calls Genesis the 1st book of Moses, Leviticus the 2nd book of Moses, Exodus, the 2nd book of Moses, Leviticus the 3rd book of Moses, Numbers the 4th book, and Deuteronomy the 5th book. So it just numbers those books. They don't go by the titles, which have apparently been assigned by the translators who translated those into English. So We find that's true in the Estonian Bible. The Estonian Bible is translated, I believe, from the Luther Bible. So I believe it's probably true in the Lutheran Bible as well. Is that true, Mr. Basingi?
Originally it was translated from German Bible.
Yeah.
And the Germans were the first ones who called those first books of the Bible, like you described, first Moses, second Moses, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If you look in the Bible from Lithuania, they're just numbered books as well. If you look in the Russian Bible, I don't know, there are some different Russian Bibles.
No, those names are quite correctly translated. The names of the first 5 books of the Bible.
So, I have read, and I'll quote somewhat from a book that is available on the subject called The Law of the Offerings, written by a man by the name of Andrew Jukes, who was an Englishman, and he wrote these books back in the 1800s. He wrote several books that are very relevant and back in the 1800s. And he talks about these offerings in the book. This book takes on the title of one of the tribes of Israel, but apparently translators chose the name of the book because the name of the book is not part of the original text. The title, the traditional title of the book, sets forth the responsibilities of the Levites in tabernacle or temple worship. So for that reason, apparently, the title was selected from the very first part of the book of Leviticus, and throughout the book of Leviticus, the Levites then are in charge of the temple worship in the Bible, and they look there for their responsibilities as what they were given for. And as we saw, the Levites were not given a homeland, and in fact they were to take care of all of the worship services, to take care of the tabernacle and those things which had to do with worshiping in the Bible. Numbers chapter 1 gives us that information. Numbers chapter 1 and verse 50 reads, "You shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, and over all the vessels thereof, over all the things that belong to it. They shall bear the tabernacle and all the vessels thereof, and they shall minister unto it, and shall encamp round about the tabernacle." So as they were traveling around, and they traveled around for 40 years in the wilderness, they had a tent which they took with them, and they took all of the things that were a part of the worship service with them whenever they moved, and the Levites were responsible for all of that. And when they came to an encampment, the Levites would set up the temple or the tabernacle in the center of the encampment, and they would encamp around that tabernacle. Verse 51, "When the tabernacle sits forward, the Levites shall take it down, and when the tabernacle is to be pitched, the Levites shall set it up, and no stranger is to come near it. Any stranger that comes near shall be put to death." Now, I don't know what the word stranger here means. We think of stranger when the Bible uses the word stranger. Normally, it means a Gentile. But in this context, it might have been Levites have this responsibility. Anybody from any other tribe who comes into it might be put to death. I don't know. I'm not sure the meaning of the word stranger there, what it means. And the children of Israel shall pitch their tents, every man by his own camp, and every man by his own standard throughout their host. So every tribe had a standard. To the north, the tribe of Dan, and the tribes that were with Dan, I believe Gad and Asher, were to camp to the north of the tabernacle. And then to the east of the tabernacle was Ephraim. Ephraim had a standard, and I believe Zebulun and Manasseh were to encamp beside him. To the south, Reuben was to set up his standard, and the tribes that were with him should set up a standard there. And on the east side, Judah had the main standard with Issachar, and I don't remember the other tribe, but anyway, they were to encamp around about the tabernacle of the testimony, every man in his own camp and every man by his own standard. So they had an organization which was reflected there. But the Levites were central to it. The Levites shall pitch around the tabernacle of the testimony. And it says that there be no wrath upon the congregation of the children of Israel. And the Levites shall keep charge of the tabernacle of the testimony. And verse 54 says, the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so they did. There is a suggestion that is made that the title of the book of Leviticus would be better served with an alternate title. And that alternate title is suggested by the first verse in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1. The Lord called unto Moses and spoke to him out of the tabernacle of the congregation. And it goes on then to say what he spoke to him about. It starts out immediately with these offerings. Here it says, called unto Moses and spoke to him out of the tabernacle of the congregation. So, a reasonable alternate title was God called, and God called, it has been suggested. The reason it's considered an alternate title is because it relates much better to the modern calling of God. And God called. To whom did God call? Well, the New Testament is filled with references to having been called. And here is this beginning of the book, starting out, God called unto Moses. Now, he's not necessarily, it is saying that he called to Moses, but it's also saying that he called, just saying that he called. And so it says, and God called. And we are a portion of those whom God has called. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14 reads as follows. Coming right down to the end of the Bible, last chapters all the way toward the end of the New Testament, it describes those people who have been in the first resurrection with Christ. And they say, and there it says there, Revelation chapter 17 and verse 14, about Christ, He is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with Him are called and chosen and faithful. So if you relate the calling that's all throughout the New Testament, it says, no man can come unto me except the Spirit of the Father draws him. There is a calling. Everybody is not able to understand the things of God at this time. They will all be able to before all is said and done. But at the present time, the Bible is very clear that there's many people on the face of this earth who don't have an understanding of what God has said, and they may try their best, but it really takes a miracle, the Bible tells us, to unlock our minds, and that miracle is known as a calling. It says to us in various places in the New Testament, many are called, but few are chosen. So it's again relating to the fact that there is a calling. But He is Lord of lords and King of kings. They that are with Him are three characteristics. First of all, they have to be called. And when it says Moses, God called out to Moses, He called, but we might say, not only is He calling out to Moses, He's telling Moses in calling out to Moses, He's telling Moses to relay these things as well to all of the Israelites. And so we might look at these things that are being relayed by Moses as the things which God has called not only to the ancient Israelites, but He has called to us. So that is a different way to look at the title of the book. We already know, prior knowledge we could say, we already know, don't we, from what we've experienced over some period of time, that the book is primarily written not to the ancient Israelites, because to them it was never going to benefit, never going to be a benefit. It is only to you and I, those whom have been called according to the Spirit of God, who are going to be benefited by the things that God called out to Moses. So that's a transformational difference, really. If you look at it that way, to those whom God has called. To whom was this book written? Was it written to the ancient Israelites, or was it written to those people to whom God was calling ultimately into His family? Verse 2 in Leviticus chapter 1. This is where it starts out right away. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, if any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord. So here are these offerings now being started to be described in the second verse. The first verse, God calls out to Moses. Reason for us to believe that He's not calling out only to Moses, but He's calling out to us. And here He starts out then speak to the children of Israel and say to them, if, now I just look at the word if any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord, what does that make it? Is it commanded? Not if it says if. If it says, if it uses the word if, it's optional, isn't it? Starts out here with this offering. This offering is known as the burnt offering. It's the first of the 5 offerings in the book of Leviticus, the burnt offering. And at least at this level, it starts out being optional, something that could be brought to God on a voluntary basis. Any man of you bring an offering, who is the offering to? The offering is unto the Lord. And then he goes on to describe what's acceptable for making that offering. And that's how the book of Leviticus begins, is with these offerings. And there are 5 of them, 5 different offerings which are involved here. Of the 5 different offerings, there are 2 different types of offerings. We might say there's an umbrella. Well, actually there are 2 umbrellas. Under the first umbrella, there are 3 different offerings. And under the second umbrella, there are 2. So let's just look under the first umbrella and see what the 3 different types of offerings are and what they have in common. Because they have something in common. They are called sweet savors. And remember, these are being brought to God. At least the first one was described as being brought to the eternal. Something that we could bring to the eternal. And we might think in terms of what we're doing today, is there something that we can bring to God? Now, but what would be a characteristic that we might find under this umbrella? It calls them sweet savors. Now, how would we describe a sweet savor? First of all, let's look at verse 9 in Leviticus chapter 1, and you just see there that it does call this first offering a sweet savor. And it's talking about the animal that could be brought. And it's supposed to be cattle, even of the herd or of the flock. And it says there in verse 9, talking about how the offering was to be processed, his inwards and his legs he shall wash in water, the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of, it calls it, a sweet savor unto the Lord. The second offering is called a meat offering, and that's a misnomer as far as I'm concerned, because we don't think of meat as being grain. But this second offering does not have anything to do with what we normally think that meat is. It is a grain or a meal offering. So we need to sort of understand that this kind of offering is not really what we would think of as a meat offering, but as a grain or a flour offering. Grain being ground into flour. And then it is offered as well. And Leviticus 2, chapter 2 begins with this meat offering or grain offering. And it says, he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest, if anyone wants to bring such an offering. Then it's a sweet savor, and here it's being written at the individual level. As we start in the book of Leviticus, it is an option being offered to the individual. Later on, we will see that it is commanded to be done by the nation as a whole. But here in the beginning, it is a voluntary thing which an individual may choose to bring. And in our own personal lives, we may as well find some things which we would choose to bring to God in a voluntary way in our service to Him. Leviticus, I'm on the wrong page of my notes again. Leviticus chapter 2 and verse 2, this is where the meal offering starts. He shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. He shall take a handful of flour thereof, and of the oil thereof, with all the frankincense thereof, and the priest shall burn the memorial of it upon the altar. I want you to notice that as we're going through here. It is, these sweet savors are being burned on the altar in the tabernacle. And the priest shall burn the memorial of it upon the altar to be an offering made by fire. And what is it called? A sweet savor unto the Lord. Leviticus chapter 3 and verse 5, you get to the third offering. And we're looking under this one umbrella. We have the burnt offering, which is called a sweet savor. We have what is called the meat offering, but it's a meal offering or a flour offering or a grain offering, which is called a sweet savor. And the third one under this first umbrella is called the peace offering. And here as well, Leviticus chapter 3 and verse 5, Aaron's son shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is upon the wood that is on the fire. It is an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. And if his offering be for a sacrifice of the peace offering unto the Lord, it should be made of the flock, male or female, he shall offer it without blemish. So that sounds remarkably like some piece of jargon meant if we don't speak of sweet savors very much anymore, but it could be, unless we really look at it analytically, it could be something that we don't really pay very much attention to. So I thought about, okay, let's say characteristically, what would we mean by sweet savors? I think of something sweet every once in a while, like almost every week. When I'm at home, Anita usually comes over and spends the night with us on Saturday night and maybe Sunday, and she often brings something which is sweet, and she makes, up until this year, only apple pie, because we only had apple on our fruit trees. This year we got a lot of peaches on our peach trees. We had so many peaches that they broke the trees down. And so she has brought peach pies now in addition to apple pies. Something sweet and something that we very much enjoy and appreciate. So that's sweet, but what about the savor part? Well, there are many kinds of food as well that we eat which we consider to be savory. I think about in regard to that, some years ago, Bryant, I heard him speak of the kitchen in McRae, Georgia. That's where Hazel was from. And every Sunday you could count on it, you know, of course after church. There would be a big gathering at the house in McRae, and there would be cooking all kinds of food and all kinds of things that you could smell coming out of that kitchen. And Brant relates in that conversation the smells from a certain kitchen in McRae. Now apparently Hazel learned very well about that. She, I put down here, remains in recovery. She continues to insist on cooking big, very enjoyable meals. And as you look at me, you can see that I have certainly been part of that situation. So Hazel loves to cook and to make things that are savory. Linda does also. We have German meals, rouladen, sauerbraten, cabbage. At church every week there is a potluck. I have been to Valdur's apartment, and he's fixed some very savory herring for me. So here's the thing. When it's talking about these offerings, it's likening the offerings that are being brought under this first umbrella as sweet savors. They are things that are very pleasant to God. So that's what we might expect. Whenever they were commanded to take these sacrificial things and put them on the altar and burn them with fire, the indication was that it would be as pleasant to God when they did that as the things that we might have in a very sweet and savory meal. So that's what it means. And that's one of the two different main types of offerings that are described here in the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus opens with these 5 different kinds of offerings, and it seems to start out that, you know, the first 3 are strictly voluntary. They're not commanded. Now that's the characteristic of a sweet savor. Where were these offerings to be made? They were to be made inside the tabernacle on the altar. Later on, inside the temple, on the altar, these offerings were to be made. Leviticus chapter 3 and verse 5 shows us that Aaron's sons shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is the wood that is fire. Sweet savor unto the Lord. So the sweet savors were to be brought into the center part of the temple, and they were to be offered there. Now that's the one umbrella. Very pleasant. The indication is these offerings represented, and we're not obviously doing the same thing as far as actually offering the offerings now that they did then, but they were very pleasant. They represented things which were very pleasant to God. Second category, under the second umbrella, characterized as guilt offerings. And there are 2 different kinds of guilt offerings that are discussed here. Whereas on the one hand, you have sweet savors, very pleasant to God, to be offered in the temple. The other 2 types of offerings, guilt offerings, they were offensive to God. And God did not want them. But He did provide for them. It's more or less, I guess, to categorize something that might be represented. It may be something like digging up the septic tank. None of us looks forward to doing that, but we know that it must be done from time to time. That's the second overall category. And in that overall category, you find that the two types of offerings are number one, the trespass offering, and number two, the sin offering. What is a trespass offering, and what is a trespass anyway? I remember when I was growing up as a boy, we used to repeat the Lord's Prayer in the Methodist Church, and we used a different set of words than the Baptist Church used. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, we would say in the Methodist Church, as we forgive those who trespass against us. But other church denominations used the words differently. They said, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are debtors against us. And so trespass and debts and the translation of that word. And then the second type of offering, which was a sin offering. What's the difference between a trespass offering and a sin offering? We can see they're both under the same umbrella. They are both offensive to God. They are both to be made not on the altar in the temple. See, on the altar in the temple, the sweet savors were to be made. They were pleasant to God. But these offensive offerings had to be taken outside the camp. You know, in the center of the camp were the Levites. Then surrounding the Levites were the 12 tribes, 3 on each side, 4 sides, those 12 tribes, and that's all part of the encampment. But these offerings had to be taken on clear past the encampment to be offered, because they were not pleasant to God, and he didn't really want them put in the tabernacle. Well, what is a trespass offering? The first one of these two is a trespass offering. Leviticus chapter 4 and verse 1, we read this. The Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, if a soul sin through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning things which ought not to be done, and shall do against any of them. And it goes on to talk about the priest and so on. But here is what the British Family Bible says about the trespass offering, which is explained here in Leviticus, at least initially in Leviticus chapter 4 and verse 2. If a soul shall sin through ignorance. Well, there's two kinds of sin, aren't there? Those that you didn't really understand. And there's a lot of people who are in that category, aren't there? A lot of people who don't understand that they are violating the commandments of God. Against any of the commandments of God, through ignorance. That's the trespass offering. When we get to the sin offering, we'll see that a sin offering is to be made for whenever we sin and know that we did something that is a sin. British Family Bible says this, commentary. It's a commentary, British Family Bible. If a soul shall sin, here it is, it says there are three conditions of the description of this sin, which is called a trespass. First of all, it was to be done out of ignorance, inadvisedly, and through surprise. You didn't know that you were doing something that you did, but nevertheless, you did. That was the first thing. It was to be done ignorantly, unadvisedly, and through surprise. It was to be against negative precepts. Sin, it says, be done ignorantly, do according to the sin through ignorance against any of the commandments against the Lord. And then it wasn't just, but it concerned things which ought not to be done. And so there were all kinds of things that the Bible talked about there in the early books that ought not to be done. And so it says don't touch a dead body, for example. Don't get involved in all kinds of things which we ought not to do, but somehow we might do it. We might, by ignorance, for example, go down to the grocery store and try to buy some chopped beef, and the grocer that we didn't know about ground a little bit of pork up in that ground beef, and we got it and we ate it. Through ignorance, we found out somehow that there was something in there that we ought not to have eaten. It was a thing which we were not to have done, which was spoken to us concerning the laws of clean and unclean meat. So that would fall into the category of negative precepts, or those things which forbade something to be done. It said, you shall not eat anything from the pig, you shall not touch him or come handling him at all. And Valder's talking this week about, he has a new job. It's a nice new job. He's very happy because he has recently gotten his driver's license, and he enjoys very much driving, and he got a job doing something he would have paid the owner to do if he needed to do it. But he held out a little while to see if the owner would hire him and pay him, and he's actually getting paid to do something that he would have paid to do. And that is driving around, delivering, and in Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings, he goes early in the morning and delivers groceries to certain people. Now he knows that in those groceries, he is also delivering unclean meat, but he's being careful not to be touching the unclean meat himself. Maybe the packaging on the outside of it, but not touching the unclean meat himself. You see, that's a thing which we're commanded not to do. And here it says, if a soul shall sin through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord, and that's sinning through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning things which ought not to be done. Now, they're probably much harder to find examples of in the Old Testament, but not in the New Testament, because here this is concerning things which ought not to be done. Do not do this, do not do that, do not do the other. and not so many things in the Old Testament about things that you must do, which are in the commandments of God. So it has to be ignorant. It has to be something that has been commanded against doing, and that it says here, the third thing, it was not to be a sin of words or thoughts, but of actions. Shall do against any. It isn't just what you think about doing, at least as it's described here in this offering. Although when we get to the New Testament, starting in the Sermon on the Mount, what does Christ say? He says, it isn't just what you do, but what you think. That's a way to maybe encapsulate part of what is being said in the New Testament. It has to do not only with what you think, with what you do, but also what you think. He says, for example, you shall not kill anyone. You shall not commit murder. You've heard it said from old times, you shall not commit murder. But I say unto you, if you have hatred in your heart, then you have already committed murder. Or lusting after a woman. If a man would be lusting after a woman, even though he didn't have an affair with that woman, it's the same thing. So you see, Christ there in the Sermon on the Mount and in other places throughout the New Testament made these things far more binding, and it's not now, as far as he's concerned, doing against taking action or doing something against those things, but it is now, regardless of what the British Family Bible may say here, it is also a matter of our thoughts as well as our actions. But those are the three things that the British Family Bible says about these two, this offering, he knew or should have known. If it's in ignorance, he didn't know or couldn't have necessarily known, then it's a trespass. It doesn't mean he's not still in need of some forgiveness, but it's not the same as a sin offering that you might commit or knowingly do. And you could think of examples of that, where a sin knowingly was committed. Just one that comes to mind quickly is Saul, when he went to the witch of Endor to get, prophetic, demon-possessed information. He knew better than what he was doing. Or you could think about David and Bathsheba. David knew not to do what he was doing. It isn't the same as finding a little bit of pork that you didn't know was there in your food. So there's two things about it. One is the magnitude of the transgression, and the second is, did you know it, or should you have known what you did was a gross violation of God's will. So that's the difference really between a trespass offering on one hand. We're under this umbrella. We've got that other umbrella over there which has the sweet savors, the things which are pleasant to God. And so I look at that and I don't think we can consider those sweet savors as having anything to do with sin, because they are clearly being categorized and explained to us in the book of Leviticus as something that is pleasant to God. No sin could be pleasant to God. No sacrifice that God would command to be done in the tabernacle and call it a sweet savor could be considered a sacrifice for sin. So that's under the one umbrella. And here we have this second umbrella, those things which are going to be taken care of outside the camp, offensive to God, guilt offerings, which still must be done. The first being trespass, started with a T. The first is the trespass offering. And we've talked about the key concepts and the difference between those two. But when it comes to sin, the sin offering, we see that Paul has, assuming Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, which seems to be the great overwhelming consensus. Some people think maybe Apollos or someone else wrote the book of Hebrews, but it appears that Paul most certainly did write it. Hebrews chapter 13, in verse 11, Paul writes about Christ bearing our sin. And he was the sacrifice for our sins. We know that. But here, as we see, they were enacting over and over and over through hundreds of years these sacrifices for sin. They were continually being made outside the camp because they were guilt offerings and they were offensive to God, while at the same time sweet savors were being offered continually. We'll see that in a minute. Sweet savors were being offered continually on the altar, inside, first of all, the tabernacle, and later on, after the temple was built, they were being offered inside the temple. But here's what it says about Christ bearing our sin, because here in Hebrews, well, a little bit of background about the book of Hebrews. Book of Hebrews was written after the Romans had destroyed the temple. And it's called the book of Hebrews because it was written to the Hebrews. And the Hebrews were in a state of frustration and concern about the fact that the temple had been destroyed and they could not properly make these sacrifices anymore because the place to do it was not there. The Romans not only destroyed the nation of Israel, but they destroyed the temple, and I believe, if I remember right from secular history, they sowed the area with salt, just to be sure that nothing grew there again. The example is, though, what they were doing with these trespass and sin offerings. They were prophetically enacting what Christ himself was going to do. They did it for hundreds of years, prophetically enacting the sacrifice that Christ was going to make himself. And Paul says after Christ made that sacrifice, then it's no longer necessary to have the sacrifices for at least trespass and sin. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 11. It says, "For the bodies of those beasts whose blood was brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned without the camp." You see, as we pointed out, these offerings were made outside the camp. Now they did bring that, they would cut the throat of the creature that they were sacrificing, catch his blood, and they brought the blood into the sanctuary, and it was taken care of there in a prescribed way. But the bodies of those beasts are burned without the camp, outside the camp. And he says that's exactly how Jesus Christ died. Jesus also, that he might sanctify with the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. See, when he was crucified, he was not crucified within the walls of the city of Jerusalem. He was crucified outside the gate. Why? Because he was the sin offering. He suffered without the gate. And he says, let us go therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. You see, he didn't deserve it. So he's saying we should have an attitude in regard to that of going to him and bearing his reproach. Okay, I'd like to point out to you here the universality of these offerings. These offerings were for all occasions. That's something that we may not necessarily have understood. We read in Leviticus 23, we read there about the offerings that are to be made on the holy days. Somewhere I think I must have missed that. We often read, in fact, usually 7 times at least during the year, about these offerings in the instructions about the holy days. And while they're in the instructions about the holy days, we may not connect them up with what's being said in Leviticus chapter 1 and the explanation of these different kinds of offerings. They're mostly not understood by us. I mean, for many years I didn't understand what these offerings made by fire represented, or what they stood for, or why we're keeping the holy days. And right in the instructions about keeping the holy days, it says you shall offer an offering made by fire, and yet we never addressed that matter. We just sort of either jumped over it, skipped around it, read it, and offered no explanation about it. And I sort of, I guess, surmised myself that this somehow related to what we brought in an envelope and dropped in the plate when it passed by us. How could we be offering an offering made by fire except we drop this in? But this is clearly referring to the offerings that are being described in the first part of Leviticus. Here's what it says, for example, in Leviticus chapter 23. It says, you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. So it's talking about the days of unleavened bread. And it says 7 days. All 7 days you offer an offering made by fire. Now, we'll see in a minute that the offerings were being made not only on these 7 days, but there were offerings which had to be made every day of the year. They were to be made continually. We'll read that. Numbers 28 does a lot to explain these offerings. Burnt offerings, as I said, were for every occasion. Numbers 28, verse 2. It says there, now you remember what we read in the first part of Leviticus? If anyone wants to bring an offering, the option of an individual, if he wanted to offer something unto God, could do it, and it wasn't necessary. It didn't reflect sin at all or trespass at all. It reflected a sweet savor, something that was enjoyable, pleasurable, sought by God. That was voluntary. Here we get to the Numbers 28, it is not voluntary. It says, command the children of Israel, say unto them, my offerings and my bread for my sacrifices made by fire, not for guilt or trespass, but for a sweet savor unto me, you shall observe, offer to me in their proper season. And you shall say to them, telling Moses to say to them now, this is the offering made by fire which you shall offer unto the Lord, 2 lambs of the first year without spot, day by day. Doesn't say sporadically, it says for a continual burnt offering. Every day of the year, every year, they were to offer these offerings continually. But then you drop down and read Numbers 28, you find there are additional offerings to be made on the Sabbath day. You know, we look at the weekday, it's maybe a good time that we could bring some thing that we would like to do for or relate to God, and it's commanded that as a church, or as a nation here it was, as a church, we should be bringing this every day. It is for a continual burnt offering. But when we come to the Sabbath day, do we or don't we, yes we do, feel that we have something more that we want to offer God than we would offer to Him just on an average day of the week. On the Sabbath day, Numbers 28 verse 9, 2 lambs of the first year without spot, and 2 tenth deals of flour for a meat offering, mingled with oil and drink offering. This is the burnt offering of every Sabbath, beside or in addition to the continual burnt offering and the drink offering. You see, there was this continual offering. Well, you made it on the Sabbath day as well, but you also, it says here, are commanded on the weekly Sabbath, this is talking about the weekly Sabbath, that you offer, in addition to what is normally made, 2 lambs of the first year without spot, 2 deals of flour for a meat offering, and so on. if you continue to go through Numbers chapter 28, you will find that on every one of the holy days there are additional offerings to be made. And so they're making the continual offerings, but then you will read in here about the additional offerings that need to be made throughout the rest of those holy occasions. I would say here, just kind of summarizing and concluding, there are three offerings which are categorized as sweet savors. They do not appear to have any connection with sin. They're important to God because they're pleasant to Him. There's the continual daily offering, Sabbath day, holy day offerings. We are to be instructed about those things. We need to enhance our concepts. We're talking about Johnson O'Connor saying your vocabulary and your concepts go together. And so let's build our vocabulary and our concepts about the offering. We can understand more about trespass, sin, and forgiveness through the sacrifice of Christ. To those whom God has called, these things have to do with the offering of Leviticus.